In the name of God who creates and redeems and sustains us. Amen. I want to talk this morning about prophets. Our culture, secular and sacred, celebrates this week the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His work as a minister of God and a leader of the civil rights movement is sufficient reason to honor him. But as the nation does honor him with a holiday, you know how holidays go, they always turn into 3-day holidays that don't really have anything to do with the date, and sometimes they have nothing to do with the event. There's always a danger of conveniently forgetting the real Dr. King in favor of celebrating an icon, of freezing him on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, as though I Have a Dream were the only speech he ever made. In the Episcopal Church, we remember Dr. King with a lesser feast day on April 4th, the day he entered into glory. It can, of course, be transferred to January 15th, but that's not the way we recognize saints in the church. It's always on the date of their death, not on the date of their birth. It is on the date they enter into glory. In our tradition, we honor prophets for a variety of reasons. But foremost, it's because they hear a message from God that is deemed important. Too important to ignore. We honor the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, the major prophets, so-called because their books are big, and the other prophets whose messages are smaller and sometimes more pointed. Prophets like Amos, Hosea, Micah, who are unfortunately called the minor prophets because their books are small. We recognize the prophet of the New Testament, John the Baptist, who heralded the imminent arrival of the Messiah. The prophets of the Old Testament often brought a message that people didn't want to hear. And that's almost a job description of being a prophet, saying something people don't want to hear. As always, the powers that be never seem to want to hear the message that prophets have to make. It's no wonder that the prophet Elijah ran off to the Sinai to hide because he feared for his life. Or that the prophet Jonah went off to sea rather than go to Nineveh and deliver the message he was told to take there. Many prophets also have the unfortunate habit of meeting bad ends. There's a tradition that Isaiah was sawn in half. We know that John the Baptist lost his head. And Jesus lived the life and suffered the death of a prophet. Faithful people tend to appreciate the prophets of the past, but they don't always recognize the prophets of their own time. After their deaths, these prophets, though they have their edges smoothed off, they are revered, as if everyone always knew they were people of God and always accepted their message. Often they're tamed. Their messages are civilized, sanded down, if you will, so they don't offend people. Sometimes a nation needs to memorialize one aspect of a prophet's words and, well, forget the rest, the inconvenient stuff. This is especially true of the prophet that we honor this weekend. Dr. King is remembered today for preaching nonviolence and for leading the struggle of Black Americans during the Civil Rights era. It was a struggle to achieve the promise that had been given at the end of the Civil War, when the North had won and the country was reunited, and when amendments were passed to abolish slavery and protect the citizenship of our Black inhabitants. Amendments that were never lived up to, despite the fact that they were made part of the Constitution. This week, a monument to Dr. King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, and local civil rights leaders was dedicated on Boston Common. No doubt many folks saw on television or saw the Boston Globe the new monument, which is quite striking. I heard all about it on the radio because I was listening to a live broadcast during the dedication. It loses a lot when you can't see it. There are monuments in schools and streets all over the country that are named for Dr. King. But what is forgotten is how many people turned on him and his message when he expanded it. It was bad enough that he called for equal rights for the black citizens of this country. But then he expanded that message to include poor people of every color, at home, and even worse, around the world. His message of nonviolence led him inevitably to criticize the Vietnam War, which was considered unconscionable by the powers that be at the time. Never mind that he was right. Jesus had a message of hope and uplift for the poor and the outcast. He had a message of peace and nonviolence. Jesus was killed for it. Likewise, Dr. King was killed. And there were so many reasons why he was killed that it's difficult to imagine him ever having been able to live to a ripe old age. He had the temerity to say that black was as good as white. The poor were entitled to a bigger piece of the pie. That peace was living in harmony with others, and that war was an absolute evil. What else could happen to someone who said things like that in as violent a country as this one is? Dr. King was a prophet, and his message rings as true today as it did in 1968. The prophets we take to heart in the Bible, whether Isaiah or John the Baptist, were as feared and reviled in their own time as they were honored afterwards. Thus it has always been. Isaiah, we heard just a few minutes ago, was given a task, not just to come to the people of Israel, not just to tell them what God would have them do, but it was too small a task. He had to tell everyone who could hear his voice or read his words. Too small a task. Thus it has always been. We are called to embrace what the prophets tell us, if indeed they reflect what Jesus taught us. In their message, we find humility, we find enlightenment, and we find God's path. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's disturbing. Sometimes it shakes us up and we want to say, I'd rather not, thank you. But the call is critically important to our faith. It's critically important to who we say and we believe Jesus is. Humility, enlightenment, and God's path are all the true marks of a prophet. If we can accept that, while the prophet is still among us until after the prophet leaves us, then perhaps we are on the right path.